Well, good evening. See if that's turned. Good evening. Tonight we're going to be doing the other side. Last week we looked at Old Testament manuscripts. This week we're looking at the New Testament. And with the Old Testament, the core, thing to take away is quality versus the number, because they went to the nth degree with the rules that they followed over time that we saw more codified later on. And when they would certify that the manuscript was correct down to the letter, they counted them, they would destroy the old one, keep the new one, and move on. With the New Testament, that's not to say that they didn't take a lot of care to try to be as exact as they could. But they also had an impetus to want to share the message, and so they wanted to get out as many as they could. So they tended to lead toward more quantity, and they started to move about. And so what we'll find with the New Testament manuscripts, that the greatest strength behind the New Testament manuscripts is the vast number of copies we have in our possession. I have numbers here that probably aren't perfectly up to date in terms of to the moment and various things, but it's close to 5,400 manuscripts, which you might be thinking, well, is that a lot? Is that not? That is a lot in terms of ancient writings in general, and we'll compare them in a little bit to kind of see why that is the case. Another point about them is that many of them, in terms of the passage of time, are closer to the original autographs than any other ancient writing. They're within, some of them, just a couple decades, if not a couple hundred years. Well, we said that's the number of manuscripts. Not all of them are complete from the whole thing. Some are pieced, some are fragments, some are larger codexes, meaning collected books, in essence, with some more, and then there are complete ones as well. It came down to what survived over time. It came down to what people had. Sometimes they didn't have all of those books because, for whatever reasons, they preferred to focus, they had certain ones here, certain ones, I don't know. Over time, some manuscripts were damaged, but there are complete ones there, and some from relatively early. There are different kinds of manuscripts. They're basically the three to remember are put into these particular categories. The papyri, which is plural for papyrus, the papyrus fragments of, at least at the date of the source I have currently, there's 88. That looks terrible. There are 88 of these. Some are quite small. Some, as we'll see one, are only a couple inches by a couple inches wide, but just stuff that we found of papyrus fragments. The unseals, and there are about 274 of these around that, have unseal lettering. I'll explain the difference in a second. And then we have 2,795 minuscules, which are later manuscripts, generally using minuscule text. The unseals tend to be earlier. Most of the papyrus fragments tend to be unseals. Minuscules tend to be later. And what the difference between those is, on the left hand, I will zoom, I think I have a set that actually zooms these. These are unseals. On the right hand are the minuscules. There it is. If you notice, this left text seems harder to read, maybe, than what we have over here. Over here has, well, what are some things, maybe I'll just ask, what are some things that are standing out between the two there? Spacing, yeah, that's the first thing, between words. Okay, if you're not familiar with the Greek text, it's kind of an unfair question, but Grover is jumping on it. The uncials are all in caps, in what would be capital Greek letters, versus on the minuscule side, you only have one that's beginning the sentence. N there. Well, I'll circle it. It's an eta, and actually that's an epsilon and a nu, but the epsilon is capitalized for the purpose of starting a sentence. On the uncial side, they're all caps. There's no spacing. One other thing is that when they hit the edge of a page here, they just keep continuing the letter on the next side. They don't stop for if a letter didn't fit. Whereas on the other side, you know, there's accounting for that. So if we look at the uncial piece, right up, it's the exact same text, actually. You have a word division here. You have a word division here. You have a word division here. Yeah, even the word division here. They're actually hard to see if you're unless you're really looking for them. And then this here, these two letters and this letter are actually one word that go across the edge. We're like, okay, why would anyone write in this particular way? Well, the nature of how writing evolved, this is how they wrote in the first century, primarily. They wrote in these block texts of capital letters that just kind of streamed together. Paul, on parchment, is writing in that form. As writing and the copying of writing, especially in Greek, and it was driven in primary part by the New Testament, evolved over time. They created the lowercase side of the alphabet, a more cursive style, to make it easier on themselves. But minuscules in this form, which if you get a Greek New Testament, this is how it's going to primarily look. It's much easier to work with. Came from the later periods, second, third, more like third, fourth century. So if you find manuscripts with this text, it's most likely closer to the time of the original writing. It does create some issues down the line in terms of translation and transmission. We'll kind of get into that with textual criticism the next time, which will be the last piece of transmission. Because sometimes if you don't put spaces between letters, well, now sometimes certain words, and this works in English too, is it this two words or is it this two words, which has led to some translation issues over time. But this is an uncial form of John 1:1. En arche e ho lagos kai, and so forth. Much easier to read this way. En arche ein ho logos kai ho logos. In a beginning, it was the Word, and the Word, it was with the God, and the God was the Word. It's literally how it comes across. We translate some things around. So those are the different ones you're going to run into. So with that, it's like, okay, I've described them. What did they look like? I have some pictures of different ones. In terms of the papyri, or the papyrus manuscripts, the really early ones, we have some from pretty early date. These are ones that have been found relatively recently in history, but were really powerful little proofs. A famous one would be, and the little P's there are just the numbering system of how they found them. They started to catalog them, P for papyrus 1, P2, P3, and so forth. And some pretty famous ones are P52, which is the John Rylands fragment. And looking at the, make sure the settings, yes, perfect. It looks like this. There are differing pictures of it. This one happens to be in black and white. But you can see, if you look closely, the little Greek letters here. It's a gamma. That's a delta. There's a few in there. Pieces of the Gospel of John. Okay, digging around, looking at something. Well, that's fun. What's more powerful about this little fragment, it's only 2.5 by 3.5 inches. So, yeah, little guy. And it's got writing on both sides. Because papyrus, the writing material, remember, was made from reeds that would be laid in a layer and another layer and then compressed like a paper. Ink didn't bleed through, so you could use both sides, unlike parchment. And that's why then they could lay them out and sew them into a book, which was known as a codex, and they'd have a book. It says, writing on both sides. What's most powerful about the John Rylands fragment is its dating, 117 to 138. Found, I think, around Alexandria, if I'm remembering correctly. It's North Africa, I believe. Egypt in that area, definitely. And here's the thing. When was the Gospel of John penned? When was John inspired to write his Gospel? Pretty late, possibly in the early 90s. It's why it's such a different Gospel in many ways. It is 89% unique. There's a theory that it was written for a later second, third generation church to deal with some problems and some misunderstandings that had come about. But if it's written in, let's say 90 or 92, and this fragment, which is a copy of it, is found 117, that's like 25 years. And it's not where John was. It wasn't in Ephesus, where he had labored for a long time. It wasn't on Patmos. It was down in Egypt. How did it get there? There was circulation. We kind of go, But there is a hostile approach to the Bible that exists that believes that none of this really mattered until Constantine many, many years later, and the things, man got involved and controlled a lot of these different things. If that were true, this wouldn't have been around. They were copying and making available these things from the very beginning. Just as the text says, Peter had copies of Paul's letters. He describes them in 2 Peter. So, the Chester Beatty Papyri, P45, P46, P47, contains most of the New Testament from AD 250. I don't think that's the next picture I have. I think the next picture is, I think that is from a codex, so I'll go back. But P46 has a lot of references to Paul's works. It contains most of the New Testament, and it's dated from about 8250. Isn't that long? The Bodmer Papyri, P66, P72, P75, includes a complete copy of many books, somewhere between 175 and 300. And these are just pieces we found. And some of these are in so many fragments that they've been able to just kind of, they collect them together. The manuscripts are the things that become the most, they have the historical connections here. Most of the names of these things are going to come down to either where they were discovered or where they happen to be residing. I mentioned that with Codex Leningraditis. Why would you say it that way? It's not Satan or whatever. For the Old Testament. Codex Vaticanus is in the Vatican. There's a reason they wanted it. They actually tried to seal it for a while. It's the oldest uncial on parchment, interestingly enough. It actually isn't on papyrus. It was on animal skin, so in a scroll form, containing most of the complete Bible, not just the New Testament, but the Old in a Greek translation. And it's from 325 to 350. And okay, these are papyrus. So that would have been P46. That would have been Bodmer, actually. Because you can see how it's in a particular book form. And it is crumpled so much on the different sides that it was considered a fragment, but it has most of the pieces. Sinaiticus here, though, is on parchment. And that's what they did here. Add a little fish decoration. It's not uncommon. Different elements to bring about. This is the beginning of Luke on. I believe this is, according to Luke, I think it's the beginning of the Gospel of Luke, given that title. And you can see all in caps. All of the pieces there are, there's no spacing. They're in just blocks. And since this is on parchment, they had a bit wider page, but they're just going long blocks down the line. And this is a leaf from it. Yes, this would be read just like English or any other Western language, left to right. Being familiar enough with New Testament Greek, I can piece together quite a bit of this. It hasn't changed at all. It's just partly the resolution of this photo isn't great. And the other thing is the tightness of the spacing. It would be easier if it was actually in front of you to kind of pull some of those elements out. But that's a tech, and that is supposed to be, not supposed to be, that's dated and known to be from 325 to 350. And we kind of go, That's profound in terms of ancient writing. Let's remember, what dates were the 27 books of the New Testament written, what range were they written in? Date range, loosely. Okay. 40 to 90, 50 to 100, somewhere in there. It's like a 50-year range. It's not much in comparison with the Old Testament, which was over, a wide range of time. And that's partly because history moved along, events transpired, and so forth. The New Testament, sometimes it's easy to forget, it's all recording events that happened prior to their writing, all in the church time. The Gospels were the apostles and prophets, the ones who had their hands laid on, Mark and Luke, recounting what had happened before. Matthew and John from their own memory, and so forth. Acts being recorded up into a point of what had happened, and then as it transpired by Luke, because he's with him. Then these letters as the church had needs over time. The Revelation either in 69 or 96, depending on how you look at it, as it's related to John. All this information just coming forth at once. And if you think in terms of world history, all this mystery, what Christ accomplished, and all this revealing information to piece it all together in this short amount of time, it's amazing. And then we have about 2,000 years of history of man, well, having a choice what to do with it. But it's not changing. And we find pieces of it not long after pen was put to page, when men were inspired to write. They didn't write, but were inspired to write. Codex Sinaiticus is an interesting one. Vaticanus is considered the oldest, and that, again, how you date these things can be kind of fluid. It can come down to where it was located, what other things it was with, what other things you could date to. Carbon dating is not useful for this kind of a thing. It's not generally useful. Anyway, so you get a bit of a range. But sometimes we can know something was a particular year or pretty close to a thing given where it was found, the other documents it was with. So Vaticanus ends up being considered the oldest. But Sinaiticus was one of the first that was actually discovered in the timeline. And Sinaiticus is an interesting one. Its name for it was found. Oh, sorry, that was a zoomed-in version of that. Sinaiticus is named for the Sinai Desert. And in their classification system, they give it the Hebrew Aleph as a letter. Don't ask me why. It's just what they did. They have all these different systems. There was a man, scholar, I don't know if it ever really said why he was in the Sinai, but he was. Tischendorf was his name, later 1800s. There was a big push for ancient rediscovery and works. Egyptology was really popular at the time. It was kind of a second Renaissance in that way. During the Renaissance, Europe was obsessed with ancient like Greek and Latin writings. And it kind of came bubbling back to the surface with going into the pyramids and going into tombs, messing with things. Like again, if it's 100 years, it's grave robbery. If it's 1,000 years, it's archaeology. It kind of got kicked off earlier in the 19th century, in the 1800s, when France tried to invade Egypt. Napoleon and France tried to invade Egypt, and it kind of didn't work, but there were a bunch of people there that happened to be hanging around, and they thought, oh, look, what are these pyramids? And they wanted to check it out. Before the government kind of stepped in and said, hey, we need to stop messing with our antiquities, they just raid places. Well, that meant they also went to some other locales, and this is probably why he was in the Sinai, because Palestine, up in there were a lot of tells they were trying to dig up, and what a tell is basically a mound where there's most likely a old city. Wars would happen, cities would be leveled, dirt would come in, animals, it would cover the city, they'd build another city on top of it. That would get wiped out, build a city on top of it, and it would start to do this. And there were a lot of tells in the Holy Land because there have been a lot of cities there that have been destroyed and rebuilt upon. So they're digging around there. Out in the Sinai, for whatever reason, he finds himself in a convent, collection of nuns out in this area, on what they believe to be Mount Sinai. That's debatable. There's a few mountains that could be. They built this like castle out there. Been there forever. He's there, I don't know if he was journeying somewhere, he stopped off there, but he notices on the cool desert nights, to keep themselves warm, they kept gathering up a bunch of what looked like old things and throwing them in a fire. There's a whole back room of them. In a funny language no one could read. Throwing them in the fire. Throwing them in the fire. He goes and checks, and one of them that he finds was at the time in the later 1800s the best and oldest in terms of date collection in Greek of the New Testament in existence by a factor of probably like several hundred years. They were about to throw in the fire. It had survived, partly because of the desert climate and various things. It was dry enough. That's what this is. Codex Sinaiticus. It was discovered by complete accident. Kind of how that works sometimes. We saw that with the Dead Sea Scrolls, just chucking rocks into a cave. Same thing. Again, for our purposes, why is that important? Well, up until this point, and it's going to become important in translation, they didn't have as good of older, closer to the original texts to work with. They'd been working on with copies of copies of copies of copies of copies of copies of copies that had carried about 1,000 years down the line. Now you find an old text like that, right? What do you expect to happen? Just like with the Dead Sea Scrolls, when you compare it to what you have. You're going to have all kinds of problems, like major problems. It's going to be teaching things that are completely different. That didn't happen. There were variants, and that we find that happened over time and got creeped into some of our translations. But what this was is it gave us a tool to then go, okay, let's start with what's closer to the original. Start with that and find, to deal with these little things, none of which have doctrinal significance, a more complete text to translate into. When we get into translation, it's going to come down to two different schools of thought, and this has kind of driven all the translations in English, German, and others for years. One philosophy is more is better, the other philosophy is older is better. And this text is one that the older is better, which I tend to subscribe to, was a great help to. When they found this, it was part of the impetus to revise the King James, because now they had a better text to work with, to not update it, bring it back to way closer to even what it should have been. They never intended the King James to be the end-all, even when they made it. Codex Alexandrinus contains almost all the Old Testament and most of the New Testament. A lot of these are full Bibles, even if they're in Greek. They're translations from Hebrew, and some of them have Hebrew in them later on. That's from AD 450. Which one these are? Yeah, I believe that's Alexandrinus. Okay. Yeah, that's Alexandrinus there with this. I think it's the end of Mark, beginning of Luke, or it's an end of one of the books at least, but I think that is that. The Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus is an interesting one. Oh, my bad. So we look at this one. There's a lot of kind of shadowing. I don't know if it's easy to see here. Kind of a lot of shadowing back here. You're seeing this extra text back here. Is anyone seeing how that's there? If this is the form that's there. This one was a palimpsest. Palimpsest. It's one of those words. It's one of those art words that's unfun to say. Anyone familiar with a palimpsest is in art? It's something that is painted over. Now, in art, that can be intentional. That can be to create an effect, to have layers. Sometimes creators would paint over their works because they were mad at their patron or they were asked to do something else. There are sometimes some pretty famous works of, editions of works from famous artists that have been painted over by lesser knowns that, who knows, This would be a case where a manuscript had been reused at a later time for a different purpose. They kind of whitewashed it and then wrote over it because paper wasn't cheap. In the chain of things, this was just another text they had. They probably had other ones like, let's just reuse this for purposes. I mean, if you want to be really cynical, it could have been someone who didn't want the Bible text found and covered it with something else. I don't know. But chemical processes have been able to reactivate it. And we can read the original writing. So the Rescriptus, originally contained most of the Bible in it. And then we have Codex Beza. That's the one I wasn't able to find a picture of. It's the oldest known bilingual manuscript, which is an example kind of as a translation, really. That's what it would be. It's kind of an interlinear in that you have a line down the page, and on one side you have the original Greek text, and on the other side you have Latin for use in the Western Empire and there where Latin was in Rome, where it was more prevalent. Someone felt it important enough to say, hey, we need to start using this to communicate to those that understand New Testament or Koine Greek, which was a good part of the world, but less and less as time went on. And they started to do that with other things. And it was from about 8400. So they were already translating these works by that point, and probably beforehand. There were a lot of, those are the uncials. If I went into the minuscules, we would be here forever. They're later. As time goes on, the problem becomes that the later manuscripts were likely copied from the earlier ones and influenced by them. And they can give good information, but you want to get as close to original as you can. If you have one misspelling in one, it'll carry forward and exponentially carry all down the line. So getting back to older is better. And turn of the century in the last 100, it's funny that the last 150-ish years have been some of the most critical time in terms of the world's approach to the Bible, but also has afforded us some of the best evidence for it together. Almost as if God knew there would be criticism and provided us with the information. Beyond the particular manuscripts, and this was, I think, mentioned by Grover maybe last week before, there is the patristic witness. It's a term for the early church writings, the early church fathers. I'm not going to say that they are authoritative, because they're not. They're not inspired. And as time went on, they got further and further from the truth. They got kind of weird. It didn't take very long, unfortunately. However, they wrote about the New Testament as they had it. What better witness to a particular thing than an eyewitness, correct? There are some classical works in the secular world that we only know exist because someone quotes from them. There are a lot like that, actually. A lot of historical references we only know about because, say, Livy in his History of Rome, or someone like that, Plato or whoever, Herodotus, quoted that person. Well, in this case, if you're teaching in the church, what are you going to quote as your authority? Hopefully the New Testament, right? You're going to quote from the Bible. The patristic witness is a name given to numerous writings of early theologians, not inspired men or different things, but which makes them kind of a secondary proof. But they live between, some of the 80, 70 is kind of reaching for a couple of them that are really early, mostly later on from 80, 70 to 430. They're actually broken down into the ante-Nicene, meaning before the Council of Nicaea in AD 325, and post-Nicene, which is after it, and the bulk are after that point, but there's still some before. But they wrote a bunch of different things. They wrote during persecution, Roman persecution. They wrote after. They wrote homilies or sermons. A lot of them. And to bolster their point, they quoted the text. They wrote commentaries. People write commentaries today. It's not a new thing. Commentaries on just a gospel is a thing. They wrote letters or epistles. And they also wrote a lot of famous apologies. Now, you probably have to understand what is meant by this. A lot of times when people hear apology, they think, I'm sorry, right? Okay, in English that is an apology. These would come from the Greek word apologia, which is the term that Peter gives. Be always ready to give a ready defense, a ready answer. They weren't apologizing in the sense of, we're sorry that we believe in Jesus. They were standing up for and answering challenges. There were several, even scholars of the day, that would challenge Christianity, and these were theologians that were defending Christianity, and then they were attacking various immoral practices. There's a lot of this stuff going around. Here's the thing about them. They provide no direct proof in and of themselves. They are a powerful secondary witness to the New Testament text. Like I said, a lot of what is in there isn't quite perfect or right. They do agree on some very specific things, such as no instrumental music, interestingly enough. But there are some things. However, among the collections of writings we have just from those authors, those writers, they quote from the New Testament over 36,000 times. 36,000 quotes. If we lost every New Testament manuscript in the weirdest library fire in history, which couldn't happen, but if we lost all of them tomorrow, we could reconstruct the entire New Testament just from quotations alone, save for 11 verses, and most of those are greetings, that kind of stuff. At least the particular text as they quoted it in their time, which is that same time that all these manuscripts are coming from. So in the areas where maybe some of these manuscripts of the day have leaves that are broken or have a little damage, what's missing is quoted by an author at the same time in its complete form. You can see how this can all be pieced together. It is insane, actually, how complete it is. Laying these things out, showing pictures of stuff, kind of like, okay. I've seen this. I don't read Greek. It's all Greek to me. I had to get there at some point, right? Let's do a comparison here with just some other ancient writings. Herodotus' history was written, it is said, I'm going to try not to slaughter these, between 480 and 425 BC. Okay? Plato, very loosely, we'll say 400 BC. There's even debate over whether he penned certain works, but whatever. Caesar, in his history of the Gallic Wars, well, we can line up Caesar pretty well, somewhere around 100 to 44, because he kind of got murdered. Can't right after he's dead. Livy or Livy, depending on your choice, his history of Rome, somewhere in his lifetime between 59 BC and AD 17. The New Testament, in terms of from, well, Matthew to Revelation, or Mark or James to the Revelation, or 3rd John, or which, in dating, whichever one came first. We're going to say AD 50 to 100 to make it simple. Okay? That's when they're supposed to have been written. So we have Herodotus' history, Plato's works, Caesar's works. When do you think, because these are influential writings that are studied in ancient cultures, ancient literature, philosophy, all kinds of collegiate courses to the doctrinal level, the doctoral level. How early do you think of a copy of their writing do you think we have? We would have to be pretty close to when they wrote it, right? We would like it to be. The reality was most of these things were lost with the fall of the Roman Empire and the supposed Dark Age. That's not a great term, actually. And really, people lost interest in human philosophy for a while because they had to, eat. You don't tend to navel gaze when you're trying to survive. But come the Renaissance around then, there was an interest in rediscovering a lot of these things, so they hunted around and tried to find the earliest forms of these. The earliest copies of Herodotus' history are from around AD 900. Same for the next two, Plato's works, AD 900. Caesar's, AD 900. I'm now kind of slaughtering that, but AD 900 for all of them. Livy, in his History of Rome, we actually do have a 4th century AD partial copy. So it's actually not as far removed as the others. But if we think in terms of a fragment, 117, larger pieces, 200, and then more complete copies of the New Testament up to 325. Well, look at the time gap. How long of a period of time between when the author is meant to have put pen to parchment and the copy that we actually have has passed with some of these? For Herodotus, it's 1,350 years. You think that might have changed in that amount of time? For Plato, it's 1,300 years. For Caesar, it's 1,000 years. If we're being generous to Livy, it's at least 400 years or so for a part of it, but for the New Testament, it's at most 50 to 225 years at most. Okay? Okay, fine. But there's still a gap of time there. Maybe if we had a lot of copies of it, we could know that everything worked out and everything was fine. I remind you that these are treated as authoritative philosophy writings by their intended authors in universities. This is what Plato wrote. This is what Herodotus wrote. The same professors that will be critical of, is this what Mark wrote, or is this some Q source and an editor and blah, 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 blah. How much time has passed? It's much narrower for the New Testament. How many copies of these things do we have in the world? Well, for Herodotus, a huge whopping 8. For Plato, 7. For Caesar, 10. Nice. Hit double digits. For Livy's History of Rome, all that we have is that one partial. I didn't tell you that. We actually don't have the whole thing. He's referenced by a bunch of other writers, so we can piece some of it together. But from him, just that partial. As of the time that I had this information, and it's probably grown since then for the New Testament, 5,366. Which is taught as being authoritative to the original author in a university setting, which is criticized. And it's just putting it to the same standards. The next step we're going to talk about, and we're going to talk a little bit, and this is one I get wary about getting too deep into because you can go a ways into it, and it's very fascinating, but people can take it the wrong way, and it's textual criticism. You hear the word criticism, you're like, oh, it's a negative. No, it's just looking at a text and letting it be what it is. And when you look at the texts, spoilers, it holds up for reasons such as this, because there's just so much more information that you have. Here's the chart in a little cleaner way than what I had. But that's a pretty telling comparison. Because the previous chart describes the known manuscript evidence of many classical writings. So there's more that you can include. These are just easily identifiable. And these are writings which scholars teach from and are considered to be authoritative. That's important. Authoritative is everything. There might be some out there that bend a little bit on this now when you point these things out, but generally it's Plato's X, his Republic, his Utopia. Aristotle's another example. We don't actually have works that are anywhere close to from when they were actually supposed to have been written. We just have what had been found somewhere. So who knows? It's really interesting with some of these. They teach them as authoritative. It's no accident that so many New Testament manuscripts were created and preserved to this day. We can trust the accuracy of our New Testament because of the multitude of manuscripts that exist and because of God who did not allow his word to fail. Just as the old was based on precision in copying, the new is based on a number. We have so many to where if there was that non-trained scribe, as it were, that is working by candlelight under persecution, just quickly trying to copy the gospel so that people know about it, trying to record Acts, trying to share the words of Paul, and you get a little thing here and there, there are so many there that the human factor is weeded out through the sheer volume. It doesn't create much of an issue, especially on nothing of salvation importance at all. Any thoughts? Does that make sense? Just got to shake it off, I guess. Why did I go there? I am so embarrassed for myself. That was the worst, but I couldn't resist. Oh no, and that's on the internet. The internet never forgets. Any other thoughts? Like I said, next week we'll look at some textual criticism. I'll try not to get too technical, but it's not meant to scare. It's meant to encourage. At first it's like, oh, but here's the thing. God and the Bible are ready to stand up to the challenges. They can take it. They can take honest questions. They can take it. And then after that, we'll start moving into translation, which becomes a little more subjective because once we hit translation, that's more man with the best of intentions than inspiration. And so I'll have to train you to think with a grain of salt. Here's a spoiler. There's no perfect translation, just so you know. Okay. If there aren't any other questions, is there anyone that needed to partake of the Lord's Supper this evening? I don't think, not recognize, seeing anyone wasn't here earlier. Okay. Is there anything else to announce or mention? Okay. Well, Eric, would you close us in prayer?